Welcome to Chatty Kathy. Today I'm really excited because I have a returning guest, Michael Medved. And Michael is a film critic, a writer of 12 books, a writer for USA Today, Wall Street Journal, and Michael is a nationally syndicated talk show host. And recently you did a show about President Abraham Lincoln. It was so incredible and educational. It would be wonderful if you could talk about Abraham Lincoln to my audience.
I'm delighted to do that, especially given Steven Spielberg's remarkable film, Lincoln. And I'm glad about that because I think that's encouraging people to actually get to know the real Lincoln. And that was the title of our special broadcast. Basically, in the course of 3 hours, I answer some of what I consider to be the miracles and mysteries of Lincoln's life. The first would be, how does somebody who really comes from nothing, both of his parents were illiterate. His father could sign his name, but just barely, but couldn't really read legal documents. His mother appears to have been completely illiterate. We don't even have an image of his mother. No drawing, of course, no photograph. There are no descriptions of what Nancy Hanks looked like. She died when Lincoln was 9. And he literally didn't own a pair of shoes when he was a boy. He attended school a total of 7 months over the course of 3 years.
So why is he so intelligent?
Right. How does somebody like that become arguably the greatest writer of English prose ever? And it is astonishing.
So tell people where he first learned to read, what kind of school that was.
Generally what would happen on the frontier is if somebody came through who could read and write, and if you didn't have a job, you'd go into these schools and you'd get a few dollars per week. It would be kids of all different ages pushed together. And you would be responsible to just drill kids reading out loud. Right. And they had sort of standard textbooks, like basically they would have 3-letter words constructed into sentences. And frankly, it's a miracle that he learned to read at all. He did. And he became consumed with reading Shakespeare and the Bible.
Wow.
And he knew the collected works of Shakespeare pretty much by heart. And he knew the Bible pretty much by heart.
And yet he wasn't religious when he was young. Am I correct?
He wasn't religious at any time in his life in terms of going to church. Part of the reason of that is a reaction against his father. His father was a very fervent Baptist. Because of his Baptist faith, even though his father was a Southerner, was very anti-slavery. Lincoln had that from his dad. But we don't really know that much about his relationship with his father, but it was deeply troubled. He was estranged from his dad. He didn't attend his father's funeral, and could have. Nancy Hanks, Lincoln's mom, died of milk sick. He apparently adored his mother. He's 9 years old. And then he's left behind with his sister, who is about 2 years older than him, and they're left behind in this cabin with a cousin while the father goes, shortly after the mother's death, back to Kentucky, and he connects with this woman, Sarah. She had lost her husband. She had her own children. She desperately needed a man. He needed a mom for his children. He did not warn his children in advance.
Did he know her previously?
He did. He said, "Meet your new mama." And there she was. And she was Abraham's protector. And I don't know if you remember the old Beverly Hillbillies TV. She's like Granny.
And did she look like Granny?
She did. And she smoked a corncob pipe, by the way, which is the kind of folks there. And by the way, the log cabin where his mother died was 300 square feet, and there were 8 people living there at one time. Now think about that.
My family, we lived in, my sister and I shared a twin bed, so I'll just tell you that.
Okay, but I assume that your living space was more than 300 square feet.
A little bit more. No,
and
yeah, I was.
Probably didn't have dirt floors.
No, it didn't.
And by the way, it tells you what kind of folks these were. Their 2 children were Sarah and Abraham. These were very biblically bound people.
Right.
And what was interesting is they also have a family heirloom Bible, even though they couldn't read. It was considered that brought sanctity and holiness into the house. I don't believe he did. His father thought that Abraham was kind of a worthless kid because he didn't really like working. He was dreamy and he spent all of his free time with books. What's so difficult about that? Beginning when he was age 10, he was working full time. And the thing about splitting rails is true. And doing farm work, and you would have to give, under the law, the quarters that he made here, the dimes that he made here, to give that to your father until you're 21.
Sounds good. Let's enact that now. Teach these kids something.
Well, that would be interesting, yeah, because usually today it goes the other way. By the way, Lincoln was a lifelong teetotaler. He spoke to temperance societies, which again, he was so ahead of his time. He's the first American politician, 30 years before any other politician we know of, who called for votes for women. Which is just, whoa, that's pretty amazing.
Yes.
And anyway, his stepmother thought that Abraham, because he had such a quick mind, would really amount to something.
She must have encouraged him then.
She did, and she lived to see him become president of the United
great.
States. And she unfortunately lived to see him murdered.
Yeah, right.
She said when she was told, you know, she expected that he would
Right.
be killed. We have to understand that his assassination came a period of violence and slaughter utterly unparalleled in American history. There's nothing like it. You can take all of the death for Americans during both World War I and World War II and Vietnam, add it together, and more people died in the war between the states than in all those other wars combined. In fact, I think it's still true that if you take all of America's wars, including Iraq, Afghanistan, combine them all, it still just about now equals. There's a fellow who went back and actually looked at population records and looked more closely, because for years and years people have been saying that 630,000 people died in the Civil War. And they now think that estimate was much too low. It was certainly over 700,000. That's not civilian casualties, that's battlefield deaths, though many of those battlefield deaths, perhaps half, were from disease and from sickness and not related to wounds. And then the number of wounds and wounded people. When you think about what this meant for the United States of America, and you think what it meant for women, because there are no men to marry for a whole generation, and a great many of the men who are looking to be married are missing limbs or wildly older. The setback here for the whole United States is really incalculable. He ended up being the difference, a lot of historians would say, in why the North won and the South lost. Why would that be? No military experience. Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, had a glittering, distinguished war record in the Mexican War. He was an officer. Lincoln said that during his military service, he was in the militia. During the Black Hawk War, he never saw battle. He just marched around with a bunch of volunteers. He said, the only blood that I ever shed in battle was to mosquitoes.
Okay. Who were his mentors? Who did he read about besides, okay, not the Bible and Shakespeare, but
Right.
who did he get all of his...
He loved a book called Pilgrim's Progress by John
right.
Bunyan, which is a great Christian book. He was a God-haunted man. Early on, he started reading atheists and doubters and embraced it when he was a younger man. And there's a fine new book by Stephen Mansfield called Abraham Lincoln's Battle with God. And he very much came back to the Bible and to religious faith. He still felt uncomfortable with church, but he came back to faith at the end of his life. And there's a great story where Joshua Speed, who was one of his oldest friends, at one point they shared a room, and yes, they shared a bed, though they were emphatically not gay. At that time, beds were expensive, and Lincoln always referred to him as Speed. Speed came into the president's office. Lincoln looks up, he said, "Oh, Speed, good to see you." And he said, "I don't want to disturb you, Abraham, because you're working." He says, "No, I'm just reading." He says, "You're reading the Bible. I'm surprised to see you doing that." And basically Lincoln says that this is a great book. And this is a man who still doesn't go to church, and he says, "And there is much profit and much gain in it, and I commend it to you." And this is a few weeks before he died. By the way, his last conversation with his wife before he died, which is in the movie, though they change it in the movie, he said that after the war finished, he wanted to take a trip to Jerusalem to walk in the footsteps of the Savior.
Jesus.
And yeah.
And in the movie it was Solomon and David?
Well, he said, "No, I want to visit Solomon and David's city." There are people who question that he even said that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But his wife said he did.
Oh, they question
Whether he said
Jesus
anything
or
about
Messiah.
going to Jerusalem. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because it would have been so unusual. I mean, American presidents at that time didn't travel abroad, and maybe he meant after he left the presidency. But remember, he had just gotten reelected. He was killed 6 weeks after his reinauguration. Had Lincoln lived, I think the entire period of history of 1865 to 1900 would have been vastly different and better.
And why did he even win? Like, I think you said something about words. Is that
Yes.
it? That he was just such a great writer and speaker?
Yes, and words mattered more then. This was a man who had lost more political races than he had won. His highest office he had ever achieved was as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, Paul Ryan had been elected to the House 7 times. Abraham Lincoln, 1 time, and then he failed. He couldn't run for re-election because he was very unpopular because he had opposed the war with Mexico. So how do you go from leaving Congress 12 years before to then running for president? And the answer is words, because his debates with Douglas. Douglas was the most famous member of the U.S. Senate. It was fairly obvious that he would be the Democratic candidate for president in 1860. But in 1858, he had to run for re-election for the Senate. And he ran against Lincoln, and they did these famous debates, 3 hours each. They're transcribed, fortunately. They had reporters there who were writing down every word.
3 hours worth?
Yeah. Yeah, now again, you
How
talk
did they
about...
okay, go ahead.
I'll tell you how they did it,
Okay.
which is fascinating, because presidential debates today, you get 2 minutes here, and then 1 minute here, and then a 30-second rebuttal, and then another comment. Judge Douglas got to begin first because he was the incumbent. Lincoln was his challenger for the U.S. Senate. So Judge Douglas gets 1 hour.
Talking for an hour?
Exactly, talk about why people should vote for him for re-election.
Okay.
Then Abraham Lincoln, who was a private citizen, he'd only had 1 term, 2 years in the House of Representatives. Then Lincoln gets an hour and a half, and then Douglas gets the concluding 30 minutes.
Right, okay.
And then they alternated. The next debate, the second debate, Lincoln got the first hour, and then, but it's so inconceivable today that a politician, and basically they weren't reading prepared text. They were, they had a few notes. They're allowed to have notes. But basically, can you imagine someone today, Barack Obama would be lost if he had to speak for an hour and a half.
That's true.
Without
Most
a prepared
politicians
text.
would.
Yeah. What was fascinating about this is these people were spellbinding, and Douglas was formidable. But Lincoln's extraordinary. The language and the use of the language and the selection of the perfect word. It's just so extraordinary, which Douglas was a fool to agree to. I mean, there's no reason in the world to agree to it. And he knew that Lincoln was smart.
So then why do you think he agreed?
Pride. Douglas was a little guy. He was 5'4", though new historians say he was probably shorter than that. They actually look at the photographs, and he probably claimed 5'4", was probably closer to 5 feet.
Is he the one that challenged him to a duel?
No,
Or
that
who
was
was that?
James Shields. He was 5'7".
They're also like these little guys.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
can I just ask you, okay, he also was challenged in wrestling.
Right.
And these people, I mean, he's just this tall guy. Why do you think these guys wanted to challenge this tall guy?
He was a newcomer in town. He had just arrived in New Salem, Illinois. And Jack Armstrong, he had a gang, not called the Crips or the Bloods, but it was called the Cleary Grove Boys, who would hang out, get into mischief together. They'd do some boozing together. There's this guy, and he's getting a lot of attention because he's very clever and he's funny and he's obviously very smart, and he's working in the local store, so everybody gets to know him in a town of 100. He says, "You think you're pretty strong? Okay, let's wrestle." And that was part of what they did, and Jack Armstrong was the local champion. And Lincoln beat him, despite the fact that he was much taller. The rules for this kind of wrestling, that draw a circle, you didn't have to pin him to the ground. You just have to have him in a hold. And Lincoln had that, but he got up in a very gentlemanly way and shook hands. And Armstrong became one of his best friends and political supporters because Lincoln was so gracious. In the same way, he wrote these letters about this guy, James Shields, who was an Irish-American who was the state auditor in Illinois and a person of some importance. Lincoln's in the legislature. And James Shields apparently was coming on to this young lady that Lincoln liked, Mary Todd, who later became his wife. Lincoln wrote these letters putting them in the name of a local belle, claiming that it was a lady. And the letters were all about how James Shields had terrible manners and smelled bad. Everyone thought this was hilarious. At one point, Shields came to Mary Todd and said, "Did you write these letters?" She said, "No, I didn't write these letters." And so he found out that Lincoln had written them. And he went to Lincoln. He said, "Did you write these letters?" And he's Honest Abe. And he said,
But he really lied once or twice, right?
They're more than, he prevaricated. He didn't lie. Shields challenged him to a duel. And Lincoln didn't like the idea of dueling. I mean, dueling is really... And remember, people died.
You could die.
Yeah, I mean,
Right,
Alexander Hamilton died in a duel. How stupid is that? Andrew Jackson was constantly fighting duels. He had 2 bullets in his body permanently from his dueling with people. He had killed people in duels. Lincoln's first thought is, dueling's not legal here in Illinois. He said, well, we can go right across the river into Missouri. It's legal there. I want to meet you on the field of honor. Lincoln was considering this, and basically he was forced to agree. He was a local politician and would be considered what today people would call a wuss if he didn't fight the duel. The tradition was that the person being challenged could choose weapons. Now, Shields assumed, like most people, that choose pistols. Lincoln did not like hunting. He had killed an animal once, a turkey, and he hated the feeling. He was opposed to hunting, another area where he's kind of ahead of his time. He says, yeah, I would choose broadswords. And Lincoln is 6'4", James Shields is 5'7". Lincoln has a natural advantage. So they come on the field of honor, you know, they go back to back, walk apart, face each other. Lincoln immediately takes the sword and he reaches up and slices off with one stroke a limb of a tree. And the limb comes down And James Shields is now looking at this and he's thinking, this is towering over me, yeah, with very long arms and very strong. And he's got this sword. He's going to slice off my head the way he sliced off that limb of the tree. So Lincoln says, why don't we shake hands? And James Shields, that's a good idea. And so he escaped from his duel with no damage except to a bough of a tree.
I remember in another show you and I had done, you mentioned his 2 secretaries.
Yeah.
And that he would talk with them all the time and tell stories and jokes. But with his wife, he didn't have a good conversational relationship with her. But yet she was educated and from a great family. So why, I'm just curious as to why they wouldn't have had that.
Well, they argued, and he would go through gloomy periods. Lincoln apparently was under pretty tight control most of his life. But he often would be silent, and he would do what he did as a young man, which got his father angry, spend all his time with books. And his wife was a chatterbox. She wasn't Chatty Kathy. She was sort of chatty Mary Todd.
All right.
And when Lincoln didn't respond, and then his wife was insanely jealous. The most famous beauty in Washington was Kate Chase. And people swooned when they saw Kate Chase. People write these long things about this example of physical perfection. She was the daughter of Salmon P. Chase. He was Treasury Secretary for Lincoln, former governor of Ohio. He had been Lincoln's rival for the Republican presidential nomination. And of all the people in Lincoln's cabinet, he was a sneaky SOB and always conspiring against him, but Lincoln liked his daughter. And he didn't like her in that way, but Mary Todd became insanely jealous. There was one White House dinner where the president was entertaining the beauteous Kate. Mary became obsessed with the idea that Abraham had something with Kate Chase, and she was mentally ill. She spent $26,000 on clothes.
$26,000 back then?
Then, yeah, equivalent of like $500,000. She got 300 pairs of gloves in 1 month. She was afraid all these young ladies would steal her husband. By the way, there is absolutely no indication at all. Again, I think the movie does a good job. It shows they had a close, intense, but rocky relationship. She would chase him out of the house, screaming and shouting, and people could hear it because the house was close by. And at one point, she chased him out of the house with a butcher's knife. And he would, on occasion, gather up one of his little boys and walk out into the street and outrun her. He once said to a neighbor, there's no helping her when one of these moods comes upon her. And the fact is, he loved her deeply. And he did trust her, and he trusted her judgment on things. And she just suffered a great deal in the White House. They had lost a child back home in Illinois. They lost another child, Eddie, in the White House.
Is that what set her off, do you think? Or would she have already had the mental illness?
No, she started with these seances. Mary had mediums who came to the White House to try to contact her dead son. One of the mediums commented they thought that Lincoln had some special access to the spirit world or something of that nature. He did talk about his dreams. He talked about a dream clearly foreseeing his own death. And the dream involved him going to the Capitol, seeing that everything was in mourning and there was a body there. And he asked a guard, who's the body? And said, it's you, Mr. President. This is not some fairy story. He shares this with the cabinet. When you think about someone like this, who writes so magnificently, when he says, my fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Now, as somebody who writes for a living, that series of words, each one is so perfect, so beautifully chiseled. We take the Gettysburg Address for granted. That's the greatest prose poem ever written in English. I mean, it is perfect. It is perfect. And this individual's ability to sculpt those words, to make the decisions he made, to have the impact he did on the people with whom he associated, it's extraordinary. Yes. There's nothing like it in history. Right. And not just in American history, in history of the world, which, by the way, is why Lincoln uniquely among American historical figures is universally admired.
Thank you for showing us some things about Lincoln that we didn't know. And I hope people will listen to your show.
I appreciate it.
To me, it's the best show on the radio.
That's kind of you to
talk
say.
Radio. Tune in every Monday at 4:30 for another episode of Chatty Kathy. Aloha.